Hi all, in this video we are going to understand what are API keys in depth and also followed by a demo where we will create an API key, store it, we will rotate it and also connect with lot of APIs, right? So let's get started. So what are API keys? API keys are basically, if you see here, these are simple unique string of characters, right? You send these keys in via client in the API request, and then API server validates it and then send you the response, right? So these are used for authentication, and you can also rate limit. Let's say if you want to track and limit like number of hits made on the APIs, then you can also create a rate limiting. Also, these are used for authorization. Let's say if you want a specific resource to be accessed in a specific APIs, then also you can make the changes accordingly. Also, there are many applications that generate the API key, they give you and then you use it. Let's say Google Maps API, GitHub APIs, right? So that you can use and work with it. Now, how API keys work? So basically, client sign up or login in APIs, right? And then they send the request. In the request itself, you see that you send the API keys. The client sends the API key, right? And client basically sends the API request with the API keys, and server validates. The API provider validates it. So everything is going in the backend, right? And then server process the request and respond back to the client. Now, how these API keys are sent? They are sent in the code, right? When you do any particular, if you run any particular program, then you add it in the header. Let's say bearer and then the key name or x hyphen API hyphen key, right? Even in OpenAI, if you connect to the model, right, then you have to use the API keys. Similarly, if you run any query, let's say get query, in the query parameter also you can pass the API keys. Now, some of the best practices are API keys needs to be rotated every after a certain interval of time. They should be used with HTTP request, and they should be given least privileges, that is the least required access, and also you should monitor the limiting rate limits. Now let's go into the demo where we will create the API keys and see how we can connect to the APIs using APIs. Now an I have created two Python programs. One is API underscore key dot py, which is having the logic to create the keys and so on. Let me show you now. So here, don't focus on each line by line. Just to see that these are the functions. So this is the first function to create a API key, right? Here we are creating the API key, and in the terminal, once it is created, you will see the scope, status, hashed key, environment, everything. Now what is the now the next function is hash key, right? A hash API key. So what is actually hash? Hashing means, let's say when the API keys are created, right? They are not stored as it is as a raw key. They are stored in the hash form so that nobody can hack it, right? So that's why they are stored as a hashed key. Now, let's say once the client sends the API key in the API request, then how does the validation happen? So validation happens through hashed key only. Whatever hashed keys we are sending in the, I mean, when we send the request, right? That request first server make the key in the hash form, then compares with the stored hashed key, right? And that's how it validates, and then it responds back. This is around scope, and this is around rotation of an API keys. These are the different functions, right? These are to check the rate limit and logging and so on, right? This was the logic function, the logic file. Now the next file I have is where we are actually using the routes to connect to the URL, and my application basically is running on Flask. I am running entire server on Flask. So if you see here, these are the routes which I have created. Routes as in, let's say if you go to this auth slash API slash create using post request, that will allow you to create the APIs keys. Here is the logic, and here in routes, you are just defining where you are going to, on which particular URL or in which particular route you are going to create API key and do all the rest of the stuff, right? So next is auth profile. This particular endpoint is used to verify whether the API key, when you send a request, whether it has a proper API key or not. If it is the proper API key, then fine. Otherwise, it gives an error that API key are required or invalid or missing read scope or rate limit exceed, something like this, right? So these are the if loop that I have added here. Now, in this endpoint is to rotate the API keys. Let's say if I go into this rotate endpoint, then it goes to the rotate API function that we have written in the next other file, and then it rotates the key and create the another key. This is for logging again, and this is for debugging, and this one is to reset. That means if I want to clean all my API keys that I have created, that way it will be able to reset it. Okay. Now I have if I run all of these endpoints, right? Let's say uh, reset, debug, and create. Running single one by one command will take some time, so that's why I have created another script, shell script, where I have added all the curl commands. If you see, first command is to create using curl command post method, and here the same endpoint I'm using API key slash create. I am passing the owner and test, right? And next is I am just checking that whether my API keys are properly stored or not. The third command is showing auth profile, right? In this particular endpoint, I am checking whether API keys are not there or not, whether they are invalid or valid. And next here in the next endpoint, I am checking scope of API key. What is the scope? Right. Similarly, on the next endpoint, I'm checking that. Here we are sending the logs, and this is rate limiting. I am checking through through for loop. When I'm hitting on this curl command profile multiple times, then I'm checking whether my APIs are properly limited or not, right? So now let's run this test file, script file, and then we will be able to understand in better way. Okay, so I'm under this folder. Let me just quickly run the API key script. Okay, now as you can see, now you will understand in better way. So if you see here, if you compare with my script here, okay, creating API key, if you see here on the top, it was showing API key, creating API key, correct? It created an API key, okay. This is the key ID, this is the API key, sk-test like this. As you remember, sk underscore is the format. Now here is the message, API key created successfully. This is the owner, this is the scope. Now my second command is to see whether API key is properly stored. Yes, it is active, it is stored. And this is how it is stored in the database in the hashed format. You will never see in the database that sk underscore test or sk underscore whatever is the format used by an API provider. You will never see that. You will generally see in a hashed format so that it is safe in the database. Let's say tomorrow if database is leaked, or if something goes wrong, then at least our keys are not publicly shown to anybody. Next command was to check whether we are passing proper API key. So we didn't pass the API key, so it gives me an error, API key required or invalid. And if I'm passing the API key properly, then it gives me the same response, environment key ID message, scope and owner. Same way, scoped key, let's say if I have changed the scope, so it shows me that it is read and write scoped key, right? Now audit log, this shows me that on this particular endpoint, through my local curl command, I was able to see this particular API key ID, right? I just tested it out, right? I have tested multiple times, so that's why it shows these number of things. Now rate limiting, let's say on this for loop, I was running the query curl command. So after fourth command, you see rate limiting means once it finds that a lot of hits are coming on my API, it sends you an error message, rate limit exceeded. Finally, my curl command is to rotate an API key on this particular endpoint, right, which we have added as a function. So if you see here, new key is generated with the expiration date, key ID, message owner, and so on, right? Okay, so now we are done with the demo also. So just finally, my final words are API key is an authentication method to connect to an application to an API, right, using a proper API key. And as an admin, it is important to create a API key with proper security in place, proper rate limiting, proper scope, and that's how a developer creates. Thank you.